Welcome everyone. Today's speaker is Maria Ramos, who received her PhD in sociology at Duke University in spring 2020. And she's currently a visiting research fellow at the Duke Network Analysis Center. And her research combines network analysis and computational methods to investigate mental models of beliefs about politics and the self. I'm really excited for today's talk, so take it away, Maria.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Alice. And first of all, I wanted to thank you for organizing this series. They have been really amazing. It's an amazing work, and I have benefited a lot from them. Every single week that I have attended, I have left inspired and really learning something new. So I really wanted to thank you for doing this. Okay, so now let's talk about the talk of today, identity structures, values, and master identities. So let's start by introducing a little bit of the problem. We all have these identities. Perhaps we have some social roles. Perhaps we are a worker, an academic, a mother, a parent. We also usually belong to certain groups. So perhaps we are a member of a sports club or a professional affiliation, or perhaps we are a member of a social club. And we also have personal characteristics that define us. So perhaps we consider ourselves somebody organized or very intelligent or very stubborn. These defining characteristics, self-descriptions that define who we are identities. So to provide you with a more formal definition, we consider identities categories of people to describe ourselves and others. For the purpose of this talk, I'm going to focus on self-description. So not so much how we define others, but how we think about ourselves. So the general problem here and what keeps me up at night is that, like also the elections, but what keeps me up at night in terms of academic life is how these identities are related to each other and what patterns of relationships are there, how those patterns of relationships come to be, and what it means for certain outcomes, usually health, mental well-being, that sort of thing. So that's my general research agenda. But more specifically, today I'm going to talk to you about these identity structures, these patterns of relations among multiple identities, and how we can map them from survey data. So today we are going to talk about how to map these identity structures from survey data and how to identify key identities. In network analysis, we always talk about key players. In this case, we are going to deal with key identities. So these are going to be called master identities. So let's talk a little bit about the theory and how people have conceptualized identity structures. So in general, people in social psychology, that's where the field that I'm drawing from, they don't explicitly use network analysis, but the conceptualization is very much in the language of network analysis. So implicitly or explicitly in most theories of identity structures, we see that they conceptualize the identities as organized around central elements that are usually called master identities. So the classic example of this would be the gender identity. The gender identity is really a classic example of how this comes into play, and it has two mechanisms of actions. Really, master identities has two mechanisms through which they organize the other elements in the identity structures. The first mechanism is through shaping the occupation of other identities. So in the case of gender, we know that, especially in certain subpopulations, we know that women or female people are more likely to occupy certain professional identities, and males are disproportionately represented in certain other professional identities. We also see that for females, it's more common that they take the caregiver role, housework roles. Really, there's a difference in the occupation of other identities. And the second mechanism by which this happens is through shaping how the identities that a person has are experienced and enacted. So if you think about the professional identity, it is possible that you have two people who have the same professional identity, but if they are female or male, the way of experiencing the identity and enacting it, perceiving things, the expectations are really different. So these are the two ways in which master identities, central identities, shape the structure of the rest of the identities, the rest of the set of identities. So usually, master identities are believed to be demographic characteristics, and within demographic characteristics, really ascribe the statuses. So ascribe the statuses are statuses that you are usually born into, and it's very difficult to leave them. So for example, gender, age, race, and ethnicity, even if you try to change them, really people will label you, and it's very, very rare that people actually change these ascribed statuses. They are highly visible. And another type of identities that have been conceptualized as master identities are values. So because values have many different definitions and ways of being conceptualized, I'm going to expand a little bit on them. So values are going to be these abstract ideas that provide guidelines for action. There are many different conceptualizations, but I'm going to take here the conceptualization by Schwartz. So here we have two basic dimensions of values. The first dimension is the dimension of conservation versus openness to change. And in this dimension, we see the tension between following traditions and the social order and pursuing new and pleasurable experiences and also pursuing autonomous decisions. So if you have a high score in conservation values, you are going to try to follow traditions and the social order across different domains of your life. And if you have low scores in this dimension, in the way it's measured, you are going to go more for seeking new experiences and making autonomous decisions. It's not that you don't have elements of both sides, but it's that you are going to be more oriented towards one rather than the other. Now, the second dimension deals with self-transcendence versus self-enhancement. And here, the tension is between caring for others and promoting equality versus pursuing your own goals and resources and striving to really achieve them. So we see this tension. And the way in which values operate is that it is believed that if you hold certain values, you are going to tend to occupy identities that will allow you to express your values. So for example, in the case of self-transcendence, it is common to see people that take the volunteer identity, blood donor identity, people that maybe volunteer for refugees, for different voluntary memberships. Maybe they are members of a humanitarian organization or an organization for the care of pets and pets' rights. Now, the action of values, it is believed to act across domains. So if you have certain values, you are going to try to select identities that are going to let you enact your values, but these identities are going to be particularly voluntary identities. And this is because scholars recognize that there is limited agency and that you sometimes, because of resources or because you are selected in identities that have differential opportunities, it is not easy for everyone to participate in these in the identities that they would like to have. So in general, this happens across domains, but you would see this particularly in different types of voluntary identities. And the idea here, and how it is described by these scholars, is that values are really the glue that hold other identities together across domains. So you would try to select into certain family roles, into voluntary identities, into certain professions, depending on the values that you hold. So this is really reminiscent to holding a bridging position. Now, it is also recognized that not only values are the glue that hold identities together, but that really demographic characteristics like gender, age, race, and ethnicity are also in bridging positions. So here the gap is that we know we have some information about this, some evidence in support of this conceptualization, but it's very limited. The first limitation is that usually the evidence has focused on experiences rather than occupation of ideas. So it is very common to see qualitative studies and also some quantitative studies looking at how identities that are considered master identities really shape how people experience and enact their other identities. So for example, here we have the control and domination identity and how it shapes dating and marriage. And we also have some evidence of age, race, ethnicity, those demographic factors, and how they interfere with the experience of worker, friend, and academic identities, how they shape the experience of those identities. Now, when we focus on identity occupation, really the limitation is that we at most have studies that deal with two identities at a time. And in particular, with the case of values, we have this study that shows, and my research is very much building on the work of Hitling. He shows that benevolence values that are a subset of self-transcendence values, they shape the occupation of volunteer identity in a sample of students through time. So he shows that holding benevolence values is related to holding the volunteer identity, and this happens across time. And this is expressed as evidence that really values are a central identity. So we really have limited evidence on really the position that values occupy when we consider the whole system of identities. And we also have lack of clarity about which specific demographic factors are master identities, especially when we consider identity occupation. We know a little bit more about experiences, but in terms of identity occupation, we have limited evidence. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on identity occupation. And what I want to offer to is that if we are going to talk about an argument about position within a structure, we really have to consider the whole, or as whole as we can, as wide as we can, a set of identities and map and study the structure. It's really not enough to consider just two identities at a time. So to do that, what I want to offer and propose is that in this project, I want to use network analysis to map identity structures because they really can capture the conceptual ideas. I want to identify master identities, and I want to evaluate the claim that values are master identities. So those are the goals of the project. Now, how to do that? The data that I'm using is data from the European Social Survey, the wave of 2002. And I utilize this wave because it is the wave that has the most self-descriptions and variables that really capture identities. So this is why I use this wave instead of others that perhaps are more recent or that have more countries. Now I utilize data from 14 countries in this data set. There were other countries that I excluded, and I usually excluded them because there were inconsistencies in the way that values were measured, or maybe it was not easy to find variables that were homologous across countries. So for example, France is a typical example. They have a different education system. The way of coding the variables is not the same across countries. So I only picked the countries that had really the same, that were comparable. And these countries include Austria, Belgium, Denmark, the United Kingdom, different countries, Slovenia, Greece, Israel, different countries. France is not there, Italy is not there, and certain others are also not there, but we have 14 countries in Europe. We have around 30,000 observations, and this is roughly 1,500 observations per country. Now, the variables that I have in this data set are self-descriptions, and these are usually categorical variables, and many times they are binary, so it's whether you hold the identity or not, whether you identify with certain description or not. So for example, whether you identify as a houseworker or caregiver, whether you think of yourself as somebody who belongs to a minority group or a member of voluntary organizations, and here we have several of them, sports clubs, social organizations, environmental organizations, etc. The religious denomination, marital status of the person, the type of occupation, and gender. Now, in terms of the demographic characteristics, we have a mix of categorical and continuous variables. We have age, education, income, some ordinal variables as well. And we have measures of values, of Schwartz values. And these are going to be, the way these are constructed is through an index based on a scale with different items. And we have scores for conservation and self-transcendence. So thinking about the network construction, we have the nodes that are going to be 41 variables in the dataset. And the edges are going to be given by the statistical dependence between pairs of variables. And we are going to calculate this through mutual information. So the question here is, why mutual information? And the reason why we use mutual information is because it really allows us to capture dependencies between different types of variables. So this is why I was telling you I have categorical variables, continuous variables, ordinal variables. If I had only continuous variables and the relationships were expected to be linear, then using correlations or another measure of dependence would have been okay. But because I have different types of variables, I use mutual information, and because I also expect to have nonlinear associations. So this is because I have, for example, age, and age is a variable that usually tends to have nonlinear associations with some other variables. So mutual information is very attractive because it let us capture these dependencies. Now, the way that mutual information works, and I want to go a little bit deep on this because I think this would be interesting for this audience, is that we calculate it through a comparison between tables. So we compare the table of observed relative frequencies to the table of expected relative frequencies that we would obtain under independence. So say, for example, that we have a variable x and a variable y. So the variable x has categories A and B, and the variable y has categories C, D, and E. So what we're going to compare is the observed relative frequencies with the expected frequencies that we would expect to obtain under independence. And these cells are going to be given under independence. We expect this to be given by the product of the margins of the cell. So AC is going to be given by the product of the margin of the column and the margin of the row that correspond to that cell. And once we have these two tables, the way of comparing them is through calculating the callback labeler distance between them. So in this way, if the distance is small, we think, okay, these two variables are probably independent. But if the distance is large, we tend to think it's evidence that these variables are actually dependent. This idea of mutual information is based on information theory and entropy. And so what we obtain after calculating this is a number that is going to range from 0, if they are independent, until plus infinity. So that's the range. But you can see that the range is not very useful. We can do better. And what we ultimately want to have is a measure of distance. Because if we have a measure of distance, then we're going to be able to we are going to be able to advantage of the network tools that we have. So based on this first calculation of mutual information, we are going to do a couple of transformations. The first transformation is we're going to transform this into symmetric uncertainty. And what this does is this transforms the measure of mutual information from 0 to plus infinity to a range of 0 to 1. So essentially what we're doing is standardizing it. How we standardize it is using this formula, and what this formula essentially does is this part here, the entropy of the variables that divided by 2, is the upper bound. So we are essentially standardizing the estimate. The second transformation we want to do is we want to transform the symmetric uncertainty into a universal version of it. And we do this because we want the measure we want to work with to have distance properties. And so the properties of a distance measure is that the distance between x and x has to be 0. We want the measure to be symmetric, so the distance between x and y is the same as the distance between y and x. And we also, very importantly, want this measure to satisfy the property of triangle inequality. And so here is the property of triangle inequality, and the distance from x to z has to be less or equal than the distance of x and y plus the distance from y to z. So right now, under symmetric uncertainty, we don't satisfy the triangle inequality property, so we cannot consider this a distance. But if we do this transformation, we can actually have a measure of distance. And I'm leaving here the reference. I can give you the reference also. I have it at the end of the talk for people who are more interested in looking and exploring a little bit more on this. So what we have at the end of this transformation is a measure that is going to allow us to measure dependence between different types of variables when we expect to have nonlinear relationships, when we want to have a measure of distance, and we also are going to have a measure that does soft thresholding. And what this is going to do is going to place more emphasis on relationships that are bigger in size compared to relationships that are small in size. And so we are going to place more emphasis on stronger associations. And this is important in terms of the issues of multiple testing and how we really expect to have associations really close to 0. Even if they are 0, it is possible that we have them close to 0. So now you see how we calculate mutual information. And the key thing to note here is that you can see that by doing these tables that are based on the relative frequencies, it is straightforward to do this for categorical variables. But the issue and why some people really stay away from mutual information is that it has problems sometimes with the continuous variables. Because when we work with continuous variables, what the method is doing, it is trying to estimate the probability distribution underlying the data. And that is a hard problem to do. So what mutual information does to solve the problem is discretize the variable. And so then we are going to have losses of information, and depending on how we do it, we could have unreliable estimates. So imagine that here we have the distribution of age across populations, and we have the density of it. And what the method is going to do is discretize it. And the real challenge comes from defining how to discretize it. What are going to be the bins? How to define the size of the bins? Maybe we want bins of equal frequency or of equal width. So to give you an example, this is the method of Astorges. So this is the method that you would get in most software, statistical software, to get at the underlying distribution of the data. But you see that if we pick these bins to estimate our mutual information, we can end up in many cases with bins that have very low frequencies, and that can make it very hard to estimate mutual information. It can lead to unreliable estimates. So what ends up happening most of the time is that we end up picking bins that are bigger and bigger. And that creates, we lose some information. So this is one of the disadvantages of the method. But to overcome this problem, so we see that we went from one distribution to a distribution that we lose information. The strategy that we can take to deal with this is first to exploratory data analysis to pick a more informed discretization strategy. And this is something that you can do when you have few nodes. This is the case in the case that I'm working on. You can also, but it would be prohibitive for people that are working with many more nodes. You can also use equal frequency bins, percentiles. These are generally more robust, but you have to be really careful and do exploratory data analysis to see if the discretization method makes sense. And what you can also do is rely on robustness tests. So you can define different binning strategies and see how robust are your results to these different discretization strategies. So until now, I have covered how to calculate the network, how we construct the network. And now when we have the network of statistical dependence between nodes, what we want to do is estimate, have an idea of the key identities, of the master identities. These are going to be bridging positions based on the theoretical framework. And so what we are going to do is use between centrality and centralization. And the decision to use these measures really comes heavily from the work of Buriline and Basie in 2017. And they work on networks of beliefs and they show that given a network of correlations, they work with correlations, between the centrality is really going to give you a good idea of central nodes that are in these bridging positions. So after we obtain estimates of between centrality and centralization, we are going to conduct certain robustness tests. And these are again inspired, these are following the work of Buriline and Basie. And what these methods are going to allow us to do is to test for variations in the sample and how these variations in the sample can maybe lead to unreliable estimates of between centrality. So for that, we are going to do a row bootstrap. And the row bootstrap, what I'm going to do is calculate 1,000 iterations, do 1,000 iterations. And for each of the 1,000 iterations, I'm going to calculate the network, infer the network, calculate between the centrality. And then I'm going to obtain the distribution of the between the centrality estimates obtained for each of the 1,000 iterations. And then the next thing that I can do is conduct a column bootstrap. And this is going to allow us to assess how reliable are the between the centrality estimates to variations in the set of nodes. So maybe some nodes are really replacing each other in their centrality. So this is going to allow us to test for this possibility. Now, once I have defined my analytical strategy, I can move to the results and see what I got when I first obtained the network at the cross-national level. So this is pulling data from all countries. And what I see here, I'm not sure if I'm the only one having trouble to see the whole picture. Maybe it's loading.
There's a white square on the left, so, but it's only in this slide. So I don't think we're seeing the full network here. We're seeing kind of the right half of it and some of it at the bottom.
Okay, I have another one. Oh, this is happening in all of them. This is weird. Okay.
But it's only the one slide, so everything else seems fine. Oh, and now we can see it. Now we see the full. Well, now we don't.
Okay, leave it there. Okay, so I'm gonna show it to you. I hope you can see more or less. If I do it like this, are you able to see?
Yeah, that looks good.
Okay, so here you see the resulting network. And what we see here is at the left upper corner, we have all of the memberships in social club, cultural club, humanitarian organizations, all of the memberships. Then at the very center of the network, we have certain sociodemographic characteristics, citizenship, income, educational level, all of these things are at the very center of the network. We see conservation taking what would appear to be a central position, but we are going to analyze this numerically, quantitatively, more in depth. And we also see a big cluster of nodes that have to do with age, with occupations, employment, with the type of occupation, and also family related. So the marital status, the number of children, household size, all of those things. Self-transcendence, we see it at the very periphery of the network, at least graphically. And then at the lower part, in the lower part of the network, we see nodes that have to do with religious denomination, religiosity, and also belonging to discriminated groups, belonging to minorities, and the migration status of people. So having parents that are foreign born and also the time in the country. Okay, so when we calculate these networks, what we see when we calculate between centrality, we see that country of citizenship really takes a central node bridging positions and bridging identities in different positions in different regions of the network. And when we do the raw bootstrap analysis, we see that reliably country of citizenship is ahead of all of the other nodes. This is consistent and is resistant to variations in the sample. What we see is then we see a set of nodes that have intermediate centralities, and we also see conservation and self-transcendence values really, I would say, not so high in the hierarchy of between centrality. These nodes that have confidence intervals starting at 0, it really means that the between centrality cannot be estimated as different from 0 when we do this raw bootstrap. So that's what we see. When we analyze the shortest paths that contain citizenship, it's really clear why citizenship is a key node. And it is because it's really bridging distinct regions. So it's really bridging, if you are from certain country, then it is more likely that you are going to have certain religious denomination, certain occupational categories are also distributed differently across countries, your occupational level, these different identities that you can have. When we do column bootstrap, we do it with in two different ways. The first way is retaining country of citizenship. So here we just want to know how robust is this result to variations in the set of nodes. So for each iteration of the bootstrap, I'm going to retain country of citizenship, but remove 10 nodes at random and see what between the centrality estimates I get. And this is going to give me an idea of maybe citizenship is really replacing another node that is really not central when I take out some nodes. And in the next bootstrap, I'm going to exclude country of citizenship. And this is where I'm going to know, okay, if I exclude country of citizenship, maybe there's another node that is replacing it that could be most central if I remove this node. Here it seems it looks like religious denomination could be a node that is equally important as a bridging node. So, okay. So if we also look, we can do this analysis with between centrality, we can also do an analysis with weighted degree to see the nodes that are highly central, but at the local level rather than at a global level. And the results are pretty similar. Country of citizenship has some strong associations, but we also have religious denomination and age as particularly relevant nodes that tend to have high degrees and also high strengths across the board, especially when you compare them to the rest of the nodes. When you look at conservation, you look at that the between the centrality is not different from 0, but when you look at the shortest paths that connect conservation with the rest of the network, it is because the shortest paths connect self-transcendence via conservation to the rest of the network. So it's really not because conservation or self-transcendence are related, are associated with these voluntary identities that we expected to see associations with, is really not true that. In fact, if we analyze the shortest paths that have and the weighted degrees that have these memberships in organizations, we say that their strongest association is always or almost always tied to the institutional domain. So for example, for religious organizations, the strongest connection is going to be through religious attendance, through religious denominations. In the case of professional organizations, it's going to be by the type of employment that you have, by whether you are an employer or a supervisor or an employee. Similarly, is going to one of the strong associations is with the type of occupation that you have. So we see that across the board is not that these memberships in organizations are tied to the rest of the network through values. It's more through the institutional domains. So when we see, okay, these are the results across nations, but maybe there's some variation within nations that we can explore. And when we look at the networks within countries, what we see is that they follow a very similar pattern. So across nations, what we see is that religious denomination and age are the nodes that really stand in contrast of many other nodes. So they tend to have higher between centralities and weighted degree compared to other nodes. And what tends to happen here is that conservation and self-transcendence, they tend to have between the centralities not different from zero. We see this across 11 of the 14 countries. Now, there is some variation in countries. So for example, here is the United Kingdom. The pattern is very similar. And there is some variation in certain countries. For example, in Germany, one of the nodes that emerges as a more central node is time living in the country. And so that gives us an idea that probably the migrant identity and migration patterns are important identities in this country. But in general, the age, religious denomination, these identities tend to be very central.
But you're just kind of starting today.
The exceptions Okay, so the exceptions are Poland, Slovenia, and Greece. And in these countries, we see that conservation takes a more central role. When we look at these countries, though, and the shortest paths, there's a stronger association between conservation and age and religious denomination. It is not so much because conservation is tied to voluntary memberships. So I did a host of analysis to explore the robustness of the results that I'm explaining today. So I tried different binning strategies. I tried removing certain nodes and just leaving nodes that are just identities, so no income, no foreign-born parents, or nodes that could be demographic characteristics, but not identities. So I did analysis with those. I did analysis with different transformations. There are different transformations that you can do with mutual information, and the results are pretty robust to this. But something that I have not done and I would like to do, and are the next steps, is okay, we see the variation in countries and we see what happens at the cross-national level, but it is possible that we have a heterogeneity within subpopulations. So what I'm working on now is dividing the networks in each country by subdemographic populations, looking at different incomes, at different ages, at different places that people live in. So for example, rurality or living in a city, these different subdemographic populations, and seeing if perhaps there are some subgroups in which conservation and self-transcendence take a more central position. But in reality, in the majority of the analysis, we see that so far, that's not what is happening. They don't connect voluntary identities. So this is important, but these are the next steps that I'm taking. So in conclusion, so far, what we have discovered is that country of citizenship emerges as a master identity and some identity that is bridging other positions across different domains. We also found the high centrality of age and religious denomination. And religious denomination is particularly important, this finding, because it goes beyond ascribed statuses to other identities that is not necessarily based on race, ethnicity, but all our gender, but other ascribed statuses. We also have clarified here the place of values in the structure. And it is important to remember, though, that this is an argument about the position, the bridging position, and not about causality. So the ideal scenario is that we have longitudinal data to really tease out the effects of one identity shaping the other. So here we can only talk about the structure, but not causality. This study, I think, brings contributions because it's a novel methodology. Nobody has used networks to map these identity structures, even though networks is really a good way to capture the theoretical ideas. This methodology also takes advantage of the data because not only is that people have focused on 2 identities at a time or a very limited set of identities, but much less we don't have evidence from cross-national comparisons. And constructing networks from survey data really allow us to do these cross-national comparisons that would be very prohibited in other studies. And so now we have a better idea of the identity structures from a bird's eye view, and moving forward theories of identities to really understand, have a better conceptualization and better measurement of what it means to have a master identity, what master identities are really doing. So this is what I have for today. I want to thank you very much for your attention and for being here. And I will welcome your questions. I will leave here also the set of references, key references for this study, so that any of you that would like to know more about the topic can do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. This was quite enlightening and a very